So back in July of 2023, I thought of a fun idea where I would set up a Google form where my audience could vote on their own peace treaty outcomes for the defeated Central Powers of World War I. I was not under any illusion that somehow they'd come up with the perfect solution and prevent World War II, that'd be ridiculous. But I was curious to see what the map would end up looking like. They had a week to vote, and so it only got 2,200 votes, but the end result was about as hilariously cursed as one would expect. But despite the map results being laughable, all you guys love the idea of perhaps trying this concept out with other things. So at the beginning of February, I uploaded the video How Europe Redrew France 1814 versus 1815, and at the end I announced I would be doing this again, but for the Congress of Vienna, the peace process at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. This time there'd be just under 4 weeks of voting instead of just 1, to ensure more participation. Why the Napoleonic Wars? For one thing, it felt a little less obvious of a choice while still having grand implications historically speaking. Secondly, I was intrigued by the outcome of this one because there are a decent number of people who both love and hate France. A few people rightfully memed the Versailles video as a Kaiser Boo fest, but this time I'm hoping things are more competitive. The peace treaty isn't even just about deciding what to do with France, it also involves redrawing most of Central Europe as well. One of the philosophies of the Congress of Vienna was attempting to establish a balance of power between the great powers of Europe. But what does that look like? Weakening France? Strengthening everyone else? A bit of both? Are we only making the greater powers greater, or are we letting some of the little guys join the team now? This time around, we had over 3 times the number of votes, with just a bit under 7,500 people participating. First, let's look at what you guys decided to do with France itself. So in my Redrawing France video, I mentioned how there were 2 different proposals for redrawing France. One in 1814, and the one that ended up happening in 1815. The 1814 one was slightly more generous to France, so I basically took the different borders of France and offered either the original 1792 borders, the 1814 proposal, the 1815 proposal, or occasionally a more wildcard option. Most of these things aren't really as massive changes as with the treaties of World War I. Part of the reason why there were more insane options for that one is the end of World War I got tied up a bit with the ideas of self-determination thanks to figures like President Woodrow Wilson, and many territorial aspects of those treaties did involve plebiscites along ethnic lines. So giving the option to have more of those would of course lead to more wild and drastic changes, which is what you guys ended up voting for. Here though, it's aristocrats and monarchs with competing interests. They would never consider that an option, so I didn't either. When it came to France's northern and eastern borders, it was closely divided in most places, but ultimately you guys stuck with the 1815 borders, except for the Swiss border, which you opted for the 1814 proposal. Again, not really a huge change, all things considered. One of the wildcard options was letting France keep huge chunks of Wallonia in modern-day Belgium, since their claim of the Rhineland area was a large historic contention at many times in more modern French history, but that barely failed by 1.1% of the vote. Interestingly, the southern border of France had the most surprising outcome, where a slim majority of you guys voted to apparently compensate Spain by giving them full control of the French region of Roussillon as well as Andorra. Andorra had historically been co-ruled by the heads of state for France and Spain, so in this case, Spain just decides from now on it's fully theirs. If you voted for this outcome, I'm curious to hear why this was the change that you guys had the strongest opinion of by far, at least of the French borders. So feel free and comment telling me why, I'm actually kind of interested. There was also a question about whether the area of modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg would still be given to the Netherlands like in 1815, or perhaps return to being an Austrian possession like it was before the Napoleonic Wars. Well, you guys said that was a resounding no, so hilariously, the Netherlands keeps all of Benelux. The next few questions involved Germany. At the start of the French Revolution, Germany was, in theory, under the control of the Holy Roman Empire, but in reality it was a mosaic of hundreds of shattered German states, ranging from massive ones like Austria and Prussia to literal city-states like Lübeck or Hamburg. Napoleon during his campaigns came in and ended the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 and reduced the number of states in Germany to merely double digits instead of triple digits. While the Allied powers of Europe weren't going to let his so-called Confederation of the Rhine stay in place, they weren't really going to go back to 1792 either. So now we have essentially hundreds of fancy landowners trying to appeal to keep their territories, or hopefully expand them, although many of them would simply be lucky not to be absorbed by their larger neighbors. With the idea of a balanced Europe, many medium-sized nations had increases in territory compared to 1792. So instead of trying to figure out some ranked auction type system between over 300 different German entities for you to vote on, I opted to keep my sanity and assume that most of Germany would at least somewhat resemble how it did in 1815. But I did have you guys vote on how much the medium nations of Germany would be strengthened or weakened. Hanover, Bavaria, and Saxony became the obvious candidates for a few reasons other than their size. Hanover had a personal union with the British that they would keep until Victoria ascends the throne in 1837, so perhaps an expanded Hanover would give Britain more influence in mainland Europe, and more of a reason to participate in continental politics. Bavaria, meanwhile, is the one power in southern Germany that could even remotely come close to competing with Austria, and maybe impact the future unification of Germany if it was strong enough to assert itself. Then finally, Saxony was notable for not only being an object of desire for Prussia, but viewed as an essential buffer state by Austria against Prussia. Saxony also weirdly had a monarchical union with the Napoleonic Grand Duchy of Warsaw, so perhaps that could be used as a reason to punish them more or eliminate them off the map altogether. So the question is, did the Kaiser boos in my audience vote to make the German states bigger or small? Are you kidding? Of course they voted to make them bigger. Saxony, however, did not have a bigger option since they actually did lose lands with the 1815 peace treaty. So you guys voted to have them keep their 1792 borders, but those were still the biggest border options possible for them. To be honest, I actually thought you'd vote to let Prussia absorb all of it, and that option did get second place in a very evenly divided vote. But nevertheless, all three got, unsurprisingly, the largest possible territorial outcome. There was also a vote on whether Pomerania should be kept by Sweden or still given to Prussia like in our timeline. And you guys stuck with that in spite of a wildcard option of giving it to Russia as a Baltic port. The other interesting bit was over the island of Heligoland, which is a small North Sea island off of Hanover and Schleswig that was owned by Denmark but seized by the British during the Napoleonic Wars. In our timeline, they kept it until 1890 where they used it as a bargaining chip. They gave it to Germany, and in exchange, Germany let the British colonize Zanzibar Island off of the coast of Tanzania in Africa. Interestingly, you guys voted to give the island back to Denmark. You guys also had a chance to restore a reformed Holy Roman Empire of some kind. You could have also just added a German Confederation like in our timeline, or even no organization at all. I almost thought you would pick Holy Roman Empire just for the memes. But no, half of you went with the German Confederation. I was actually kind of surprised. Next, there was a question about the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Half of you decided that the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, minus Poznan being given to Prussia, would exist as an independent Polish buffer state. I'd imagine Prussia and Austria would prefer that over Russia getting all of Poland, but either way, it'd be interesting to see how long this state would even last. I could imagine some scenario where the 1848 revolutions flare up and the Polish populations in Prussia and Austria and Russia rise up, and then the three of them decide to partition Poland again. But who knows? Either way, this is definitely an interesting choice. The next set of questions involve the Mediterranean and Adriatic. Remember how Napoleon annexed Dalmatia and Illyria to France? Yeah, that was kind of weird. But it was mainly a way to keep Austria in check after putting them down for like the fourth or fifth time. I lost track, honestly. But there are still many things to consider for this area. For one, Venetia. In 1797, France and Austria agreed to a temporary peace where they partitioned the Venetian Republic, Austria getting Venice itself and most of its Adriatic possessions. With that in mind, I presented the option of restoring an independent Venetian Republic, either partially or wholly in Italy, which the majority of you voted for. I also made a question about restoring the Republic of Ragusa, another Adriatic republic that got swept up in this mess, and you also voted to restore it. It was kind of at this point I realized, as much as it's a meme to hate on France, a lot of you guys just aren't interested in letting Austria have anything either, which I find hilarious. Next up for vote were the Ionian Islands, which became a British possession until unified with an independent Greece a few decades later. In this case, you voted to give them back to an independent Venice. You also voted that Hospitaller Malta would be restored instead of it being given back to the British. Perhaps the most insane question on the survey, though, is whether Napoleon is still exiled to St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, or if he's given a second chance at ruling the island of Elba as his personal domain. In the end, you decided to go for it. The funny thing is that in the original terms, Napoleon would rule Elba as his personal domain until his death, in which the island would be returned to Tuscany regardless. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not the biggest deal. But perhaps if Napoleon lives longer, maybe there's some weird chance Napoleon III in France seizes power and then seizes Elba upon Napoleon I's death? I mean, it's a big if. He would have to live another 20 years, but he died in his 50s, so I guess it's technically possible. I mean, that would be an interesting scenario, so who knows? For the final section of the survey, we're going to see how you guys handled colonial holdings. While France lost most of its colonies in the 7 Years' War, they still had several possessions in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean. Some were confiscated by the British, others were given back. Of the colonies that were debated upon whether to give back to France or not, all of them were just given to the British by you guys, except for, surprisingly, Mauritius, which France would not keep in our timeline. You voted to let them have it back by just 20 votes, and interestingly, Saint Pierre was also given to the British, despite France keeping that in our timeline. Although between you and me, from a purely geographical aesthetic standpoint, I'm actually really happy about that. Then I also made a separate question for the French colony of Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe, that's one of the two. I don't know French. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British seized the island but gifted it to Sweden in 1813. So I asked whether you guys would give it back to France or let Sweden keep it, and most of you decided it would stay Swedish. Then finally, the last two questions were about Guyana in South America. Before the wars, there was French Guiana in the east, and then modern-day Guyana and Suriname were Dutch. Britain seized all of this, but after the war kept modern-day Guyana and only gave Suriname back to the Dutch. First, you all voted that the Dutch are being given all of their parts of Guyana, which will have interesting implications down the road when it comes to the border dispute with Venezuela later on. Perhaps they're more willing to settle than the British did. Then, as for French Guiana, I threw in a wild card about perhaps giving it either to the British, back to the French, or Portugal, since they still owned Brazil at this time. It's not like Brazil would gain independence just a few years later, right? Right? Well, regardless, amazingly, you decided to give it to Portugal, so yay, Brazil mentioned, I guess? So at the end of the day, in terms of actual territorial changes, this survey is much less drastic than the one for the World War I treaties. Looking at the new altered map of 1815 Europe, there were definitely some changes, but instead of Super Germany or Super Hungary, it was just Super Hanover and Super Bavaria, and restoring a few nations. But I honestly find this a lot more interesting in more subtle ways. Would a stronger Hanover, Saxony, and Bavaria make Prussia unifying Germany under its guidance a lot harder? In many ways, yeah. Even with Austria being slightly weaker in this outcome, I imagine these three might feel more emboldened to resist Prussian domination unless forced to. Prussia still had the military prowess to probably pull it off, but it would be a bigger challenge. And of course, any change in the unification of Germany alters modern history as we know it. In addition, letting the Danish keep Heligoland removes a bargaining chip for the British in its colonial rivalry with Germany. If Germany does unify, perhaps there's a minor colonial conflict with the British before World War I. Will Poland survive up to 1914? Will Venice unify with Sardinia to form Italy? Would the world be ready for tropical Swedes in the Caribbean? The other notable thing is that in our timeline, the British took Heligoland, Malta, and the Ionian Islands to not only enhance their control of the seas and trade routes, but in a weird way to keep tabs on continental affairs without actively being on the continent. They could intervene in any part of Europe if they had to, but they stayed at sea. With this survey, other than Gibraltar, they don't have that path anymore. They ironically have their connection to the continent through Super Hanover. Even if they still lose Hanover by 1837, as a foreign policy strategy, this has a lot more subtle implications down the line. At least I think so. What happens after they lose Hanover? Does Britain have less of a foothold on the continent? I'd be interested to hear your guys' discussion about that in the comments. And with that, that concludes this next set of map gore that you guys have brought upon the world. If you'd like to see a better resolution of this map of Altered Europe, as well as another map of what the Caribbean would look like based on your changes, you can access them as members of my Patreon. I'm grateful to make a living off of YouTube, but it's not the most reliable source of income. Every bit of support from viewers like you helps keep the channel going. So if you'd like to support this channel so I can keep making fun videos like this or other historical content, you can become a patron. Or alternatively, you could also become a channel member if you'd prefer that instead. Thanks to all of you for your support, and thanks for watching. I'm Emperor Tigerstar, and I'll see you guys next time.